The rock came out of the dark without warning, tumbling end over end, wrapped in ice and dust, moving faster than anything born of nature should move. On the bridge of a living ship, shaped like folded silver wings, a woman named Orin Kale gripped the edge of her console and watched the numbers fall. 11 hours. That was all the time left before the object reached the small blue world spinning quietly on the edge of a minor star system, a world that did not yet know it was about to end. Orin Kale was not human. Her people, the Vantheri, had crossed more distance than any human mind could easily picture, chasing energy signatures and gravity echoes across 1,000 years of travel. They had found many worlds already dead, burned to ash by fire from the sky, or frozen by suns that had gone quiet too soon. This one was different. Sensors showed water, showed green, showed the faint chemical fingerprints of life, just beginning to crawl, swim, and breathe. It was young. It had not even learned to look up yet. "Confirmed trajectory," said a deep voice behind her. This was Commander Thessaly Vane, the leader of the small fleet, a tall figure with skin like polished stone and eyes that held centuries of memory. He did not raise his voice, but the weight in it was enough to silence the low hum of worried chatter across the bridge. "Confirmed," Orin answered. "Impact point, Northern Hemisphere, shallow sea. If it lands, the dust alone will choke the sky for years. Nothing large will survive it. Not the little ones already crawling on the land. Not what they might have become." Thessaly studied the display a long moment. 10 ships. That was the entire strength of this scouting fleet, sent far ahead of the greater Vantheri civilization, to map new worlds and record what they found. 10 ships were not built for this kind of work. They carried scanners, translators, small defensive weapons for pirates and debris, nothing capable of stopping a mountain falling from space. "Options," he said simply. A young engineer named Ren Ashcombe spoke first, his voice tight. "We could fire everything we have at it, break it into smaller pieces. Even so, the pieces would still fall. We would only be trading one disaster for many smaller ones." "Not enough," Thessaly said. "What else?" Orin's fingers moved fast across her console, pulling old data from the ship's deep memory, records passed down from engineers long since gone. "There is another way. Dangerous. And it has never been tested outside of theory. We could use the ships themselves, all 10, linked together, to generate a gravity pulse strong enough to bend the rock's path, not destroy it, redirect it." "And the cost?" Orin hesitated only a breath before answering honestly, "Because that was the way of her people. If we link the ships and hold the pulse long enough, the strain will likely destroy several of them, possibly all of them. We do not know if we can survive it." Silence swallowed the bridge. Somewhere below decks, the low thrum of the ship's heart continued, steady, and unaware of the decision being made above it. Every person on that bridge understood what Orin was really saying. There was a very real chance that saving this world meant losing their own lives doing it, far from home, for a species that did not even know they existed. Thessaly walked slowly to the wide viewport, where the small blue and green world hung like a fragile marble against endless black. He thought of his own homeworld, of the mistakes his people had made in their younger centuries, chasing conquest before wisdom, learning too late the value of what they almost destroyed themselves. He thought of every dead world they had passed on the long journey here, worlds where no one had come in time. "Link the ships," he said quietly. "All 10. We hold nothing back." No one argued. No one hesitated. Across the fleet, ships that had traveled together for decades opened their deepest systems to one another, a bond few had ever attempted, each vessel bearing its core to the others, like old friends offering their last strength without asking anything in return. The countdown became a living thing on every screen. 10 hours. 9. The rock grew larger in the long-range scanners, no longer a distant speck, but a jagged, tumbling giant, glowing faintly at its edges as it began to feel the pull of the small world's atmosphere. Orin worked without pause, sweat beating at her temple despite the cool air of the bridge, translating ancient formulas into commands the linked ships could understand. Ren monitored the strain building in the engine cores, calling out numbers that climbed steadily toward danger. Thessaly stood at the center of it all, calm on the outside, feeling every rising heartbeat of his crew as if it were his own. 6 hours. The first ripple of the gravity pulse went out. Invisible, silent, a wave bending the very shape of space around the fleet. The rock did not change course. Not yet. The pulse needed time to build, layer upon layer, each ship adding its strength to the growing field. 4 hours. A warning alarm cut through the bridge, sharp and sudden. One of the linked ships, the smallest of the 10, had begun to fail, its core straining past what it could safely hold. Its crew refused to disconnect, choosing instead to push harder, feeding every last measure of power into the shared pulse even as their own systems began to fold in on themselves. "They are going to lose the ship," Ren said, voice cracking with the effort of staying steady. "They know," Thessaly answered. "Let them choose." 2 hours. The rock's path had begun, at last, to bend, so slightly that only the most sensitive instruments could detect it. A shift measured in fractions of a degree. It was working. It was simply not working fast enough. Oren poured everything she had into the calculations, adjusting the angle of the pulse in real time, chasing a target that refused to sit still. Her hands shook. Her mind did not. Somewhere in the back of her thoughts, she pictured the small world below, the crawling, swimming, breathing things that had no idea their entire future balanced on the next 90 minutes. 1 hour. The smallest ship's core failed completely, and its crew transferred every remaining bit of power into the shared field before their vessel went dark and silent, drifting now, lifeless, a small sacrifice folded into a much larger effort. On the bridge, no one spoke. There was no time to grieve. There was only the work. 30 minutes. The rock's path bent further, faster now, the accumulated force of 9 remaining ships finally overwhelming the object's stubborn momentum. Oren watched the numbers with something close to disbelief. It was going to miss. Not by a wide margin, but it was going to miss. 10 minutes. The great tumbling mass roared past the small blue world close enough that its shadow briefly darkened half a continent below, close enough that instruments on every ship screamed with proximity warnings, and then it was gone, hurtling onward into the endless dark, no longer a threat to anyone. The bridge erupted, not in loud celebration, for the Vantheri were not people who shouted easily, but in a quiet wave of relief, so deep it felt physical, shoulders dropping, breath released all at once, hands reaching for other hands. Thessaly allowed himself one long moment at the viewport, looking down at the world they had just saved, a world whose people would never know how close they had come to never existing at all. Below him, in shallow oceans and quiet forests, small creatures continued their simple lives, unaware that 10 strangers from a distant star had just given them every tomorrow they would ever have. "Set a marker," Thessaly said finally. "Deep orbit, low power, something that will last. Not a message. Not yet. They are not ready to hear from us. But leave something, so that if they ever grow wise enough to look, they will know they were not alone that day." Oren nodded and began the work, encoding a simple signal into a small, silent device, no larger than a stone, and releasing it into a slow, stable orbit, far above the atmosphere, where it would drift for longer than any single life could measure. The remaining 9 ships gathered themselves, gently retrieving what could be salvaged from the vessel that had given everything, honoring their fallen crew in the quiet way of their people. And then, without fanfare, without announcement, they turned their bows away from the small blue world and continued on into the dark, carrying their secret with them. Below, life continued exactly as it had before, except now, it had a future. Small creatures that would one day stand upright, build fires, write stories, and look up at the stars with wonder, had no idea that somewhere above them, in a silent orbit, a small marker waited, holding the memory of a debt that had not yet been named, patient enough to wait as long as it needed to be found. Millions of years would pass, continents would drift, ice would come and go, creatures would rise, fall, and rise again in different forms, until one day, a species finally stood on 2 legs, looked up, and began to wonder what those distant points of light might actually be. The marker waited. It had all the time in the world. Centuries after the marker settled into its silent orbit, far across the gulf of stars, the world that had sent it was no longer the world it once was. The Vantheri homeworld, a planet called Iridath, had grown proud, then careless, then hungry, in the way that even wise civilizations sometimes fall, when their reach grows faster than their patience. What began as small disagreements between distant colonies had, over generations, hardened into open conflict, and what began as conflict had, over more generations still, become something far harder to stop. Sarah Voss had never known peace. She had been born in the middle years of the Long War, in a colony station orbiting Iridath's outer moon, and by the time she was old enough to hold a weapon, she had already learned that survival meant trusting almost no one. She was a pilot now, 30 years old, with a scar along her jaw from a crash she barely remembered, and eyes that scanned every room out of habit before she allowed herself to relax. The war had not been fought over land, not really. It had been fought over what remained of a dying resource, a rare mineral called ashlight, that powered every major system the Vantheri depended on, from their ships to their cities, to the great shields that protected their remaining settlements, from the increasingly hostile radiation pouring off their aging sun. Iridath's own star, once stable and generous, had begun to fail decades earlier than any of their scientists had predicted, and the panic that followed had turned neighbor against neighbor with frightening speed. Sarah guided her small transport ship through a debris field that had once been a thriving station, now nothing more than twisted metal and broken glass, drifting silently in the dark. She had flown this route 100 times, carrying supplies between the last handful of settlements still willing to work together, dodging patrols from factions who would rather see everything burn than share what little remained. "You are being followed," came a voice through her calm but urgent. This was Daniel Cole, her closest friend since childhood, now serving as her navigator, and the only person left she trusted without question. He sat beside her, eyes fixed on the small scanner built into the dashboard, watching 3 unfamiliar signatures close in from behind. "Raiders or military?" Sarah asked, already banking the ship hard to the left, weaving through a narrow gap between 2 enormous slabs of broken hull. "Does it matter anymore?" Daniel said, and she almost laughed, because he was right. There was no real difference these days. Both wanted the same thing. Both would take it by force if given the chance. She pushed the engines harder, feeling the ship groan under the strain, and cut through the debris field with the kind of reckless precision that only came from years of practice and no other choice. Behind them, the pursuing ships opened fire, streaks of pale energy slicing past, close enough to rattle the hull, close enough that Sarah felt her own pulse hammering in her throat. "Left tunnel now," Daniel called out, and Sarah obeyed without question, throwing the ship into a narrow service corridor built into the ruined station's frame, a space so tight that her wingtips nearly scraped the walls on both sides. The pursuing ships, larger and less nimble, were forced to break off or risk their own destruction, and for a moment, just a moment, silence returned. They did not celebrate. There was no time for that anymore. Sarah guided the ship out the far end of the corridor and set a new course for the last supply outpost still standing, a place called Halden's Rest, tucked into the shadow of a dying moon. When they landed, the outpost greeted them, with the same tired weariness Sarah had come to expect everywhere. Thin, hollow faces watched from doorways. Children who had never known a single day without fear peered out from behind their parents. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of everything that had already been lost. She found the outpost's leader waiting near the landing pad, an older woman named Marin Dusk, whose calm, steady presence had somehow held this last community together through years that should have broken it apart entirely. Marin had once been a scientist, part of the team that had first detected the failing star, and though her warnings had gone unheeded for years, she had never stopped trying to hold what remained of her people together. "You made it," Marin said, relief plain in her voice as she helped unload the supplies from Sarah's ship. "We were starting to think this run had failed too." 3 ships tried to make sure of it, Sarah answered, wiping sweat from her brow. "We got lucky." Marin's expression darkened. "Luck is running out for all of us, Sarah. Come inside. There is something you need to see." Inside the outpost's central hall, a cracked and flickering display showed data that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Iridath's core readings, gathered from the last functioning monitoring stations, showed the planet's magnetic field weakening faster than anyone had predicted, the protective barrier that shielded their world from the sun's increasingly violent output beginning to fail in earnest. "How long?" Sarah asked quietly. "Best estimate, less than 2 years before the surface becomes unlivable for anyone without heavy shielding," Marin said. "And that is if nothing else goes wrong, which, given everything, seems unlikely." Daniel stepped closer to the display, studying the numbers with the same focused intensity he brought to every problem. "What about the remaining fleet? Could we evacuate everyone who is left?" Marin shook her head slowly. "Not with what we have. Most of our long-range ships were destroyed or repurposed for the war years ago. What remains could carry perhaps a tenth of the population that is left, and that is being generous." The room fell into heavy silence. Outside, a thin wind rattled loose panels against the outpost's outer wall, a small reminder of just how fragile their remaining shelter truly was. "There has to be something," Sarah said, refusing to accept the weight settling over the room. "We cannot just wait for the end." Marin looked at her for a long moment, then walked to a locked cabinet at the far side of the hall, pulling out an old data core, scratched and worn with age. "There is one thing," she said. "Something buried in the old archives, from before the war, before we forgot how to look outward instead of at each other." She activated the core, and a faint hologram flickered to life above the table, showing star charts far older than anything currently in use, along with fragments of old exploration logs. Sarah recognized the emblem stamped across the files, the mark of the ancient scouting fleets, sent out generations ago to map worlds beyond their own system. "One of the old logs mentions a world," Marin continued. "A small planet, far beyond our current reach, where a fleet once intervened to prevent a natural disaster from wiping out early life. The log is incomplete. Much of it was lost or corrupted over the centuries, but it suggests the fleet left something behind. A marker, meant to be found later, meant to open a door if we ever needed it." Daniel frowned. "You are talking about a debt, a very old one, and a very uncertain one. We do not even know if that world developed anyone capable of understanding a signal, let alone anyone willing to help a civilization they have never met."
"I am not asking anyone to bet everything on it," Marin said, "but I am saying it is the only thread we have left to pull."
"Everything else has already failed us." Sarah studied the star chart for a long moment, tracing the impossible distance between where they stood and that small marked world, a distance that had taken the original scouting fleet a full generation to cross. Even with their best remaining technology, reaching out and receiving any kind of answer would take years, if an answer came at all. "What would it even take," she asked finally, "to send something, a real signal, not just an old marker sitting quietly in orbit?" Marin's eyes sharpened with something that looked almost like hope, an emotion in short supply on this dying station. "We would need to restore one of the old deep space relays, the kind built before the war, the kind capable of pushing a signal far enough and clear enough to be understood by anyone who might be listening. There is one such relay, badly damaged, sitting in the ruins of the old research station near the northern pole. If we could reach it, if we could repair even part of it, we might have a chance." "That region is contested," Daniel said, "held by whichever faction currently controls the polar mines. Getting a repair crew in and out without drawing fire would be close to impossible." "Impossible is a word for people who still have other options," Marin said quietly. "We do not." Sarah looked around the hall, at the tired faces of the people who called this fragile outpost home, at the children who deserved a future far bigger than what remained of their dying world, and something inside her hardened into resolve. "I will fly the mission," she said. "Get me a crew. Get me whatever parts we can scavenge, and I will get us to that relay." Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then I am flying with you. Someone has to keep you from doing anything too reckless." Marin allowed herself the smallest flicker of a smile, the first Sarah had seen from her in longer than she could remember. "Then let us not waste what little time we have left." Over the following days, the outpost worked with a kind of desperate energy Sarah had not felt in years, scavenging parts from broken ships, calling in every remaining favor from allied settlements, assembling a small crew, willing to risk everything, on a signal aimed at a world none of them had ever seen, and could not even be certain still held anyone capable of hearing it. The journey to the Polar Research Station was brutal, cutting through contested territory under the constant threat of discovery, dodging patrol ships twice, losing one crew member to a collapsed tunnel during the approach, a loss that settled heavily over everyone who remained. When they finally reached the ruined relay, half buried beneath ice and debris, it looked less like salvation and more like one more broken piece of a broken world. But Daniel, with steady hands and years of quiet skill, worked through the damaged systems piece by piece, coaxing life back into circuits that had been silent for decades, while Sarah and the rest of the crew held the perimeter against increasingly frequent patrol sweeps. On the final night, as the last patrol ship's engines faded into the distance and the relay's ancient systems finally hummed back to life, Marin's voice crackled over the comm from Halden's Rest, tight with barely restrained emotion. "You have one chance to send this properly. Make it count." Sarah stood beside Daniel as he keyed in the final sequence, the old star chart glowing softly on the relay's cracked display, the coordinates of a small, distant, blue world locked into place. She thought of everyone left behind at the outpost, of every settlement still clinging to survival across a dying planet, of a debt so old that the ones who once earned it had likely long since forgotten it was ever owed. "Send it," she said quietly. Daniel pressed the final control, and somewhere in the vast dark between the stars, a signal began its long, silent journey outward, carrying with it a message shaped from desperation and faint hope in equal measure, aimed at a small blue world that had no idea it was about to be asked, after all this time, to remember. The alarm tore through the night shift control room so suddenly that Elena Marsh spilled her coffee across the console before she even registered what she was reacting to. Red warning lights washed the dim room in pulsing color, and every screen around her flickered with the same impossible readout, a signal pouring in from deep space, at a strength no natural source should ever produce. "Tell me this is a system glitch," she said, already knowing it was not, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up the raw data stream. Across the room, a younger technician named Priya Bhatt stared at her own screen, in open disbelief. "It is not a glitch. Signal strength is climbing, not falling. Whatever this is, it is not weakening with distance the way it should. It is almost like something out there wants to be heard clearly." The observatory, perched high in a remote mountain range where the night sky stayed clear and dark most of the year, had spent decades listening quietly to the universe, cataloging the faint whispers of distant stars and the occasional flicker of something unexplained. Nothing in its long history had prepared the small overnight team for what was now filling every receiver in the building. Elena had joined this observatory 8 years earlier, drawn by a childhood fascination with the idea that humanity was not truly alone, an idea she had learned to keep quiet about in professional settings after one too many raised eyebrows from senior colleagues. Tonight, for the first time in her career, that quiet conviction did not feel foolish at all. "Get Liam on the line," she said. "He needs to see this before anyone else touches it." Liam Carter arrived at the observatory less than an hour later, hair still damp from a hurried shower, jacket thrown on over pajamas, looking every bit like a man who had been dragged out of a warm bed in the middle of the night and was not yet sure whether to be annoyed or terrified. As the observatory's lead researcher, he had seen his share of false alarms over the years, misidentified satellites, stray radio interference, equipment malfunctions dressed up as mysteries. This did not look like any of those. He studied the incoming data for several long minutes without speaking, his expression shifting slowly from professional skepticism to something far more unsettled. "This is structured," he finally said, almost to himself. "Look at the repetition pattern. That is not noise. That is deliberate." "Deliberate meaning what exactly?" Priya asked, though the tightness in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. "Meaning someone, or something, built this signal to be found," Liam said quietly, "and built it to be understood." Over the following days, word of the discovery spread carefully through a small, trusted circle of scientists, kept deliberately quiet from wider attention, while the team worked to confirm what they were seeing was real, and not some elaborate technical error. Additional observatories around the world, brought in one by one under strict confidentiality, independently detected the same signal, each confirming what the mountain team had first found. This was not a malfunction. This was real. and it was coming from somewhere far beyond anything humanity had ever reached. Elena barely slept during those first weeks, splitting her time between analyzing the raw structure of the signal and digging through decades of old satellite records, chasing a strange instinct that told her this was not the first time this particular frequency had touched Earth's neighborhood. Her instinct proved correct in a way that sent a chill down her spine. Buried in archived data from an aging deep space monitoring satellite, long since decommissioned and mostly forgotten, she found a faint, nearly imperceptible signature, recorded decades earlier, dismissed at the time as sensor drift, and never investigated further. When she compared its structure against the new incoming transmission, the match was unmistakable. Something had left a marker in Earth's orbit long ago, patient and silent, waiting. "This changes everything," Elena said, calling an emergency meeting with Liam and Priya in the observatory's cramped conference room, laptop screens crowded with overlapping data. "Whatever sent this new signal, it is connected to something already here, something that has been here for a very long time." Liam rubbed his eyes, the weight of sleepless nights clearly showing. "You are saying we have had a visitor's calling card sitting in our own orbit for who knows how long, and nobody noticed?" "Nobody was looking for it," Priya said. "Why would they be? It was designed to be quiet. Remember, deliberate, but not intrusive. Whoever left it did not want to be found by accident. They wanted to be found when we were ready." Elena pulled up the decoded structure of the new incoming transmission, a complex layered pattern that had taken their combined team nearly 2 weeks to begin properly untangling. Beneath the mathematical framework, embedded carefully enough that only patient analysis could reveal it, lay something that looked almost like a story, told in symbols rather than words, images built from light and shadow, meant to be understood by any mind capable of recognizing patterns. The first clear image the team managed to extract showed a small world, unmistakably resembling early Earth, oceans and continents, in unfamiliar shapes, shifted by time, and a massive object hurtling toward it from the darkness of space. The second image showed ships, 10 of them, arranged in a careful formation around the falling object, and lines of light connecting them together. "They are showing us something that happened here," Elena said slowly, the pieces settling into place with a weight that left her breathless. "A long time ago, before any of our recorded history, something almost destroyed this planet, and something else stopped it." The room fell silent, as the implications settled over all three of them. If the ancient signature buried in the old satellite data and the current desperate transmission truly came from the same source, then somewhere out among the stars existed a species that had, at some point in Earth's deep past, intervened to prevent humanity's entire existence from being wiped out before it ever truly began. "And now they are back," Priya said quietly. "Or at least, someone connected to them is." Further decoding over the following weeks revealed the transmission's true nature, and it was far more urgent than a simple greeting or historical record. Hidden within the deeper layers of the signal was something closer to a plea, images of a dying world, a weakened protective barrier, crumbling structures, and figures that appeared increasingly desperate as the sequence progressed. Whatever species had once saved Earth was now, generations later, facing its own extinction, and reaching out across an impossible distance in the faint hope that the small blue world they had once protected might somehow be able to help in return. Elena brought the fully decoded findings to a private briefing with senior government scientists, her hands steady despite the enormity of what she was presenting. The room, filled with skeptical faces more accustomed to funding disputes than existential discoveries, grew progressively quieter as she walked them through the evidence, the ancient marker, the new transmission, the unmistakable images embedded within it. "You are telling us," said one senior official, a stern woman named Grace Whitfield who headed the newly formed advisory council on the matter, "that not only are we not alone, but that we already owe our very existence to whoever sent this message." "That is exactly what the evidence suggests," Elena said, "and they are asking for help, though the signal does not demand anything. It simply shows what happened, and shows what is happening to them now. The choice of what to do with that information is entirely ours." Grace studied the decoded images displayed across the briefing room's main screen for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And if this is some kind of trap, a story designed to earn our trust before asking something far more costly than we realize, It is a fair concern, Liam said, stepping in beside Elena. But everything about the signal's structure suggests patience rather than deception. Whoever sent this waited generations for us to become capable of even receiving it, let alone understanding it. That is not the behavior of a species trying to trick us quickly before we can think clearly. The debate that followed stretched across weeks, filling closed government chambers and quiet late-night conversations among scientists who found themselves suddenly responsible for a decision far larger than any of them had ever imagined making. Some argued for extreme caution, pointing out that humanity had no real way to verify the full truth of what the signal claimed, no way to be certain that reaching out again would not expose Earth to unknown risk. Others argued that a species capable of decoding an ancient debt and choosing honesty over manipulation deserved, at the very least, the chance to be heard fully. Elena found herself at the center of the growing storm, called before increasingly larger panels to explain and defend the science behind her findings. Her quiet observatory routine replaced almost overnight with a whirlwind of meetings, briefings, and mounting public curiosity as rumors of the discovery inevitably began to leak beyond the tightly controlled circle that had first uncovered it. It was during one particularly difficult session, facing a room full of skeptical military advisors, that Elena finally said the words that seemed to shift the tone of the entire debate. We are not being asked to fight a war we do not understand. We are being asked whether we remember how to be grateful. Whatever we decide, we should decide it as who we actually are, not who we are afraid of becoming. Grace Whitfield, who had remained largely silent through most of the heated exchanges, finally spoke into the quiet that followed. Assuming we choose to respond, and assuming that response becomes more than words, what exactly would helping even look like? We do not have ships capable of reaching wherever this signal originated. We barely have consistent crewed missions beyond our own moon. Liam pulled up a secondary set of data his team had extracted from deeper within the transmission. Technical schematics embedded alongside the emotional imagery. Diagrams that, once properly translated, revealed propulsion concepts far beyond anything currently in active human development. They left us more than a story, he said. They left us a way to reach them. It will take years to build, and even longer to fully understand every part of what they have shown us. But it is possible. They are not simply asking for help. They are offering us the means to give it. The room absorbed this new information in stunned silence. What had begun as an unexplained signal disrupting a quiet night at a remote mountain observatory had grown, over the span of a few short months, into the framework for humanity's first true reach beyond its own solar system, driven not by conquest or curiosity alone, but by the discovery of a debt older than written history itself. In the months that followed, nations that had spent decades competing for dominance in nearly every arena found themselves, almost reluctantly at first, cooperating on a scale rarely seen in human history. Scientists, engineers, and dreamers from dozens of countries converged around the shared technical schematics, working with a sense of urgency that came not from fear, but from something closer to obligation, freely accepted. Elena stood once more before the observatory's wide window late one night, months after that first chaotic alarm had shattered her quiet routine, watching the same patient stars that had first carried the ancient marker to Earth so long ago. Priya joined her quietly, 2 mugs of coffee in hand, offering one without a word. "Do you think they know we are coming?" Priya asked softly. Elena considered the question for a long moment, thinking of the desperate, dignified images embedded so carefully within that impossible signal. "I think they are hoping," she said finally, "and I think that after everything they once did for us, without ever asking anything in return, the least we owe them is the chance to hope for a little while longer." Behind them, in laboratories and workshops scattered across the globe, humanity had already begun building the ships that would carry them across the stars, guided by blueprints left by strangers who had saved their world long before any human eyes had ever learned to read the sky, driven now by a simple, powerful truth that Elena repeated quietly to herself every night before sleep finally found her. They had been given a future once, without ever knowing to ask for it. Now, at last, they had the chance to give one back. The ship shuddered violently as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel, alarms screaming across the bridge before anyone had even caught their breath. Captain Nora Bennett gripped her chair with both hands as the entire vessel groaned under the sudden stress, her eyes fixed on the forward display where the target system was supposed to be waiting calmly. Instead, chaos greeted them. "Report!" she snapped, voice cutting through the noise. "Radiation levels off every chart we prepared for," called out Oliver Bright, the ship's chief engineer, sweat already beading on his forehead as he fought to stabilize the shields. "Their star is degrading faster than the data we received suggested. We are taking damage just sitting here." Nora forced her breathing steady, years of training overriding the instinct to panic. This was humanity's first ship to cross such a distance, built from blueprints given by strangers, crewed by volunteers, who understood they were stepping into the complete unknown. And now, within minutes of arrival, that unknown was already trying to tear their ship apart. "Get us behind that moon," she ordered, pointing to a rocky shape on the display that offered at least partial shelter from the worst of the radiation storm rolling off the dying sun. "Now." The pilot, a steady young man named Ethan Cross, adjusted course immediately, weaving the large vessel with careful precision through a field of drifting debris that had clearly once been other ships, remnants of the long war Nora's briefing packets had only partially prepared her for. The moon's shadow finally swallowed them, and the worst of the alarms fell silent, replaced by the heavy sound of the crew catching their breath all at once. "Report casualties," Nora said quietly. "None, Captain," Oliver answered, relief plain in his voice. "Shields held, barely. But we cannot stay in open space near that star for long. Whatever protection this world once had, it is failing fast." Nora studied the planet now visible beyond the moon's edge, a world that should have looked far more familiar, given how much of its ancient technology had shaped the very ship she now commanded. Instead, it looked wounded, patches of its surface dulled and cracked, thin streams of atmosphere visibly leaking away, where the failing magnetic field could no longer hold everything together. "Open a channel," she said. "Let them know we are here, and let them know why." It took nearly an hour of careful signal adjustment before contact was finally established, static and distortion slowly resolving into something closer to clarity. When the response finally came through, it was not the calm, composed voice Nora had expected from a species that had once mastered interstellar rescue on such an impressive scale. It was tired, cautious, and unmistakably human in its exhaustion, despite belonging to someone entirely alien. "This is Halden's Rest Control, unidentified vessel," came the voice, strained but steady. "State your intentions before we are forced to treat you as another threat." Nora leaned toward the comm herself, choosing her words carefully. "This is Captain Nora Bennett, of the ship Horizon, representing the people of Earth. We received your signal. We are here because, a very long time ago, your people saved ours. We have come to return the favor, however we can." A long silence followed, stretching so far that Nora began to wonder if the connection had failed entirely. When the voice returned, it carried an entirely different weight, disbelief, tangled tightly with something that sounded painfully close to hope. "Earth," the voice repeated slowly. "The small blue world. You actually came." "We did," Nora said. "Permission to approach and offer assistance." Another pause, shorter this time. "Granted. Follow the beacon we are transmitting now. And Captain Bennett, welcome. It has been a very long time since anyone here had reason to say that word and mean it." Guided carefully through the debris field by the transmitted beacon, the Horizon made its slow approach toward Halden's Rest, the outpost appearing gradually out of the darkness, smaller and more fragile than Nora had expected, clinging to the shadow of its dying moon like a small, stubborn flame refusing to be extinguished. Sarah Voss stood at the landing pad as the massive human ship settled down, its size dwarfing anything currently in the outpost's possession, its unfamiliar design drawing a crowd of quiet, wide-eyed onlookers from every corner of the settlement. She felt Daniel step up beside her, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and cautious relief. "They actually came," Daniel murmured. "After everything, they actually came." The ship's boarding ramp lowered slowly, and Captain Nora Bennett stepped out first, followed by a small team of scientists and engineers, all moving carefully, respectfully, aware that they were stepping into a world already stretched thin by loss. Sarah studied the captain for a long moment, taking in her steady posture, the careful way she scanned the gathered crowd, clearly searching not for weakness to exploit, but for whoever might need help first. "Captain Bennett," Sarah said, stepping forward. "I am Sarah Voss. This is Daniel Cole. We sent the signal that brought you here." Nora extended a hand, a human gesture that Sarah recognized from the translated cultural files included with the original transmission, and shook it firmly when Sarah hesitantly returned the gesture. "Then it seems we owe you our thanks twice over, once for the debt your ancestors created by saving us, and once for having the courage to reach out again when things grew desperate enough to need it." Marin Dusk arrived moments later, moving with the careful authority of someone who had spent years holding a fragile community together through circumstances that should have broken it entirely. She studied the human visitors with sharp, evaluating eyes, before finally allowing herself a small measure of relief. "You understand what you are walking into," Marin said, addressing Nora directly. "Our world is dying. Our resources are nearly gone. Whatever assistance you offer will not be a simple task with a simple solution." "We understand," Nora said. "Our own history is not free of hard lessons either. We came prepared to work, not to offer easy promises we cannot keep." Over the following days, the human crew and the surviving Vantheri worked side by side, with an intensity that quickly erased whatever initial hesitation had lingered between them. Oliver Bright, alongside a talented young Vantheri engineer named Thessaly's own grandson, a quiet, brilliant young man named Cale Ashen, dove into the failing planetary shield systems, combining human problem-solving with ancient Vantheri technology in ways neither culture had previously attempted. "The core stabilizers are not broken," Cale explained during one long overnight session, pointing to a section of damaged machinery buried deep beneath the outpost. "They are simply starved. The war diverted resources away from maintenance for years. If we can restore proper power flow, even partially, we could slow the shield's collapse significantly." Oliver studied the schematics with growing excitement, cross-referencing them against data the Horizon carried from Earth's own advanced solar research. "Our ship carries components designed for radiation shielding around our own sun's more violent moments. They were built for a different purpose, but the underlying principles might translate. Give me access to your fabrication systems, and I think we can build a bridge between your technology and ours." Elsewhere across the settlement, other members of the human crew worked to assist with more immediate needs, distributing advanced medical supplies to treat radiation sickness that had become distressingly common among the Vantheri population, helping repair failing water purification systems, and sharing agricultural techniques that could coax food from soil increasingly stressed by the planet's declining stability. Sarah found herself spending most of her time alongside Nora, the two women developing an easy, mutual respect as they coordinated the growing rescue effort, planning evacuation routes for settlements too damaged to save, and identifying which structures could realistically be stabilized with combined human and Vantheri effort. "Your people did not have to come," Sarah admitted one evening, the two of them standing on the outpost's outer platform, watching Earth's ship and Vantheri repair crews moving efficiently across the settlement below. "You could have simply acknowledged the debt and moved on. No one would have blamed you for choosing safety over risk." Nora considered the observation seriously before answering. "Maybe not. But there is a difference between owing something and choosing to honor it. Your ancestors did not save my world because they expected anything back. They did it because it was right. I think the least we can do is meet that same standard, even now, especially now, when it actually costs us something." Not every part of the effort went smoothly. Tensions still simmered among certain factions, who had spent the war years hoarding resources and distrust in equal measure, and several attempts were made to disrupt the growing cooperation, viewing the arrival of outside help as a threat to whatever fragile control they still held over the dwindling supplies. One such attempt came dangerously close to disaster when a small group attempted to seize control of the Horizon's shuttle, hoping to claim its advanced technology for themselves, rather than share it across the wider population. Daniel, patrolling the perimeter that night alongside a small security detail, was the first to notice the intrusion, moving quickly to intercept the group before real harm could be done. The confrontation was tense, filled with raised voices and genuine fear on both sides, but ended without serious injury when Marin herself arrived, speaking with the calm, unwavering authority that had carried her community through years of hardship already. "We have spent too long tearing each other apart over what little remains," Marin said firmly to the gathered intruders, her voice carrying clearly across the tense platform. "These people did not have to come here at all. If we cannot learn, even now, even at the very edge of everything, to work together, instead of against one another, then perhaps we never deserved saving in the first place." The words landed heavily, and slowly, reluctantly, the group stood down. The immediate crisis diffused, though the deeper fractures within Vantheri society remained far from fully healed. Nora, watching the confrontation resolve from a short distance away, understood clearly that rebuilding this world would require far more than technical repairs alone. As weeks stretched into months, the combined efforts of both worlds began to show real, measurable progress. The planetary shield, while still far from fully restored, stabilized enough to slow the worst of the radiation damage, buying precious time for further repairs. Additional human ships arrived gradually from Earth, carrying more supplies, more engineers, more willing hands, eager to help however they could, drawn by a growing global sense that this shared effort represented something larger than simple obligation. Standing together one quiet evening at the edge of the outpost, watching a newly repaired section of the planetary shield shimmer faintly back to life against the darkening sky, Sarah turned to Nora with an expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and genuine hope. "We are not saved yet," Sarah said quietly. "Not fully. There is still so much left to rebuild." "No," Nora agreed, watching the faint shimmer above them with quiet satisfaction. "But for the first time in longer than either of our people can probably remember clearly, we are not facing it alone." Above them, the restored shield flickered steadily brighter, a small but undeniable sign that the long, difficult work of saving a dying world had, at last, truly begun. The ground shook so hard that dust rained down from the ceiling of the northern shelter, and for one terrible moment, Kale Ashen was certain the entire structure was about to collapse on top of the 200 people crowded inside it. The planet's magnetic field, still only partially restored despite months of steady repair work, had suffered a sudden violent collapse across an entire region, and now a wall of unfiltered radiation and superheated wind was tearing across the surface toward the last unprotected settlement still standing in its path. "Shield integrity failing across Sector 9, Oliver Bright's voice crackled urgently through Kale's comm, tension sharp in every word. "You need to get everyone underground now, Kale. You have maybe 6 minutes before that storm front reaches your position." Kale did not waste breath answering. He was already moving, pulling frightened families toward the reinforced underground shelter, built months earlier, during the first wave of joint human and Vantheri construction efforts, shouting instructions over the rising howl of wind, now audible even through the settlement's thick outer walls. Outside, Sarah Voss fought her small transport ship through turbulence violent enough to rattle her teeth, making one final desperate sweep across the settlement's outer edge, searching for stragglers who had not yet reached safety. Daniel's voice came through sharp and urgent from the seat beside her. "There, near the old water station. 2 more. They are not moving fast enough." Sarah dropped the ship low, dangerously low, skimming just above the rapidly darkening ground, as the first edges of the radiation storm began licking at the horizon behind them. She threw open the side hatch, and Daniel reached out, hauling 2 terrified children aboard, just as the ship's outer hull began to groan under the storm's growing pressure. "Go, go, go," Daniel shouted, and Sarah pulled the ship into a hard climbing turn, engines screaming, racing the collapsing wall of light and heat toward the safety of the shelter's landing platform. They cleared the outer doors with mere seconds to spare, the storm slamming into the settlement's reinforced shields, just as the heavy blast doors sealed shut behind them, the entire structure shuddering under the impact but, crucially, holding. Inside the packed shelter, silence stretched long and tense as everyone listened to the muffled roar of devastation passing overhead, waiting to learn whether their combined efforts had truly been enough. Slowly, gradually, the roar began to fade. When Kale finally dared open a narrow observation port, the sky outside had calmed, streaked now with the eerie afterglow of the storm's passing, rather than active devastation. The settlement had survived, battered but standing, thanks to shields that would not have held even a season earlier, before human and Vanthari engineers had worked side by side to strengthen them. Nora Bennett arrived by ship within the hour, immediately organizing damage assessment teams alongside Marin Dusk, the two leaders moving through the shaken but grateful crowd, with the practiced efficiency of people who had faced too many crises together already, to waste time on anything but immediate action. "That was close," Nora said quietly to Sarah, once the initial chaos had settled into the steadier work of recovery. "Too close." "But we held," Sarah answered, exhaustion plain in her voice, but so was something else. A quiet, hard-won confidence that had not existed in her a year earlier. A year ago, that storm would have ended this settlement completely. Today, we lost nothing but some damaged equipment. It was, Nora reflected privately, a fair measure of just how far they had truly come. The months following the Horizon's initial arrival had not been easy, marked by setbacks nearly as often as breakthroughs, but the steady, patient combination of human ingenuity and ancient Vanthari knowledge had gradually turned the tide in ways that once seemed impossible. The planetary shield, rebuilt piece by piece using a careful blend of restored ancient technology and newer solutions brought from Earth, now covered nearly 2/3 of Iridath's remaining habitable regions, a coverage level that continued expanding steadily as more sections came back online. Entire settlements once considered lost causes had been stabilized, their populations no longer living under the constant threat of sudden radiation exposure or failing life support systems. Beyond the technical rebuilding, something deeper had also begun to shift across Vanthari society itself. The fractured factions that had spent years locked in bitter conflict over dwindling resources found themselves, almost without realizing it, drawn back together by the shared, visible proof that cooperation produced results that isolation and hoarding never could. Old rivalries did not vanish overnight, but they softened, worn down gradually by shared labor, shared meals, and shared relief whenever another section of the failing world was successfully stabilized. Marin Dusk, addressing a growing council of settlement leaders several months after the northern storm, allowed herself something she had rarely permitted during the darkest years of the war, a genuine, unguarded smile. "We are not simply surviving anymore," she told the gathered representatives. "For the first time in longer than most of you can remember, we are actually building something again." The council chamber, once a cramped makeshift space in the corner of Halden's Rest, had itself grown alongside the recovering settlement, now housing representatives from a dozen previously isolated communities, human engineers and scientists included among the regular attendees, their voices treated with the same weight and respect as any Vanthari elders. Cale Ashen, no longer the anxious young engineer who had first worked alongside Oliver Bright in those early desperate weeks, now led an entire division dedicated to expanding the restored shield network further across the planet's remaining regions. His work, blending human solar shielding technology with his grandfather's ancient formulas, had become something genuinely new, a hybrid science, belonging fully to neither world alone, but born instead from their combined effort. "We could not have done this without you," Cale told Oliver during a quiet moment following one particularly successful shield expansion, the two of them standing atop a newly stabilized ridge, overlooking a valley that, only a year earlier, had been an uninhabitable radiation scar across the landscape, and was now, slowly, beginning to show the faint green traces of returning plant life. Oliver studied the valley with quiet satisfaction. "I think that is rather the point, Cale. Neither of us could have done this alone. Your people gave mine an entire future once, long before we knew enough to properly ask for it. I would say this makes us close to even." Cale shook his head slowly. "I do not think debts like this ever really become even. I think perhaps that is not really the point of them at all." Back on Earth, the growing success of the rescue effort had transformed public understanding of the mission in ways few could have predicted when Elena Marsh first decoded that impossible signal in a quiet mountain observatory. What began as a closely guarded scientific discovery had become a genuine point of shared human pride. Nations that once competed fiercely for influence and resources, now finding common purpose in supporting the continued flow of ships, supplies, and volunteers, traveling to help stabilize a dying world, light years beyond their own. Elena herself made the long journey to Iridath 18 months after that first chaotic alarm, standing now on solid ground beneath a sky that, while still recovering, no longer threatened sudden violent collapse at any moment. She found Nora waiting for her at the landing platform, the two women sharing a warm, genuine embrace despite having only ever spoken through distant communication channels before this moment. "It is more beautiful than I expected," Elena admitted, looking out over the recovering landscape, patches of resilient green pushing steadily back against the scarred, dulled ground that still marked much of the planet's surface. "Even wounded like this." "It is healing," Nora said simply. "Slowly, but it is healing." Elena spent the following weeks working directly alongside Vantheri scientists, comparing notes on the ancient technology that had first saved Earth so long ago, filling in gaps of knowledge that neither species had fully possessed on their own. It was during one such session that she finally met Oren Kale's own distant descendant, a thoughtful young historian named Sarah's cousin, a woman who had spent years quietly preserving fragments of the old scouting fleet's records, determined that the sacrifice made so long ago would never be entirely forgotten. "Your ancestor made a choice that cost her people everything they had to give that day," Elena said, studying old preserved records showing the original rescue mission, the small lost ship, the careful marker left in patient orbit. "I do not think there are words strong enough to properly thank someone for a gift like that." "Perhaps not," the historian answered gently, "but I think what you and your people have done here says it clearly enough regardless." As the second year following first contact drew to a close, a formal ceremony was arranged at Halden's Rest, now grown into a genuine city rather than a struggling outpost, to mark the official restoration of Iridath's planetary shield to full, stable strength across every remaining inhabited region. Representatives from Earth and Iridath gathered together in numbers that would have seemed impossible only a few short years earlier. Human and Vantheri, standing side by side beneath a sky finally, fully protected once more. Nora Bennett and Marin Dusk stood together at the center of the gathered crowd, two leaders who had guided their respective peoples through the most difficult chapter of this shared journey, watching as the final section of the restored shield shimmered fully to life across the horizon, a steady, unbroken band of protective light stretching from one edge of the sky to the other. "Your ancestors saved a world that did not yet know how to say thank you," Marin said, addressing the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled gathering. "Today, I think we have finally found the proper way to say it, not through words alone, but through everything we have built here together." Applause and quiet, emotional celebration spread through the crowd, human and Vantheri voices mingling freely, in a moment that felt, to nearly everyone present, like the true closing of a debt that had spanned generations and impossible distances alike. Later that evening, as the celebration continued below, a small child named Lyra, barely old enough to remember the darkest years of the war, wandered quietly away from the gathered crowd toward a quiet viewing platform overlooking the now fully lit city. She pressed her small hands against the cool glass, staring out at the stars scattered thickly across the newly protected sky, searching, as children often do, for the particular distant point of light that adults had told her marked the direction of a small blue world called Earth. She did not know the full history yet, not really, not the way the adults around her understood it, the ancient sacrifice, the desperate signal, the long, difficult work of rebuilding a dying world through shared effort and hard-won trust. She knew only the simple, comforting truth passed down to her already in the gentle stories told at bedtime, that long ago, strangers from a world called Earth had saved her people when they had nowhere else left to turn, and that those same strangers had never once asked for anything in return except the chance to help. Somewhere far above her, unseen and unknown to the small girl pressing her hands hopefully against the glass, that very same distant world continued spinning quietly through its own steady orbit, carrying within it the memory of an ancient marker left long ago by strangers who had never expected to be thanked, a memory that had, against every impossible odds, finally found its way home. The stars above Lyra's small upturned face glittered on, patient and endless, holding within their quiet light the full, unbroken circle of a debt given freely, remembered faithfully, and repaid, at last, with everything two worlds had left to give.